In 1971, I began volunteering at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and I stayed there for about 15 years. I was the artist in residence and curator. It was my responsibility to decide what exhibits we would have, research those exhibits, and also lecture on those exhibits. So that exposed me to the history of African people in America every day. So after 15 years, I began to study African material culture, and I decided that we needed to know more about Africa. So I began to search the ideal of opening an African bead museum. I'm Is Dabls, the founder of MBAD ABA African Bead Museum, which was founded in 1998. In the early 80s, around 1985, the city of Detroit started having festivals at Hart Plaza, and those festivals were put on by the 7 cultures that were in this city. So that automatically meant they were bringing in an international group of people, because you had the Polish festival, the Italian festival, the Greek festival, the Mexican, so you're getting the drift. And those festivals normally represented the particular participants by highlighting the food and music. So that brought in international vendors. A lot of those vendors came from Africa, and a lot of those vendors brought beads with them. The beads caught my attention because it was something that, in my studying of African material culture, was not much said about the beads. It was mainly the sculpture, the textiles, and the metal items. So I began to study the beads, because about that same time, there were 3 or 4 books came out on the history of beads, beads of the world, Ghanaian beads, and these books caught my attention because they didn't think in terms of the beads being adornment. The beads communicated specific information about the wearer, initiation, rites of passages, and some of the beads that people wore, they wore those beads throughout their whole life. So that fascinated me, because here were some things that said that we were the creators of the philosophy and the ideals that govern these items. So I said, oh, this is good here, and it didn't have the same stigma as the sculpture pieces. The sculpture pieces came with a lot of negative information, and that information is probably still lurking over the sculpture pieces today. But here we have these innocent looking beads that, so I thought, until I began to sell the beads. Then there were people coming in, so is that voodoo? I'm saying, how can they ask that question? Where's that coming from? So there's a school of thought out there that was still teaching that anything remotely coming out of Africa had a negative connotation. But I said, I'm still going with these beads, because these African bead dealers, they brought all these beads in, and they were dumping them on me because they're heavy. They wasn't selling, and here I am buying them. So I decided to open an African bead museum. This was in 1998 when I moved here. So I decided, I said, well, you're in the community, why not just hang them off the wall and have the children come in and experience the energy behind them and call it a day? And that's why the beads are in here like they are now. There are beads in here hanging around you that are 300 and 400 years old, and some are even older. And it's the way they are presented, it eliminates that material value of them. Now it's just strictly aesthetics and ethnographic value, the way the beads are presented here. So out of that came a way of me being able to display the beads without incurring a lot of costs of having display counters, lights shining on them. So I'm gonna do this in a different fashion, and it caught on. I came to Detroit in 1966, and it's been my home, because what has happened, things occur and change occurs so fast. We have a tendency to think that I had an option to live any way I wanted to in America. That is not the case. There was only certain places that I could even live in the city of Detroit. So that question is kind of one that I just normally don't even comment on. Just I like living on the north end of Detroit. The city of Detroit was not available for us to live anywhere at any time. That only occurred after Detroit was abandoned by its former owners, and we got it by default. We could move anywhere in this city. Therefore, it takes up a block and a half, and it deals with the relationship between Africans and Europeans over a period of 500 years. Working with the museum, it became quite obvious to me that to talk about the relationship between Africans and Europeans would always lead to some kind of a stress point where people would begin to stop listening at each other and just focus mostly on their own points of view. But with the metaphor, I'm able to create stories. The most important thing about history is to learn a lesson. All the other stuff is insignificant, but it's kind of difficult to learn that lesson if it's structured as blaming, inciting someone. So with my metaphor, I'm able to construct these installations. For instance, one deals with the concept of iron teaching rocks table manners.